for MEG-12, a survey course in 20th century Canadian literature. And today we are going to delve a bit deeper into development of Canadian criticism. And it will have four units. And unit 29 to 32, we will be navigating. And let's start. So this is unit 29, and here we discuss about the recent development of the Canadian criticism. In particularly this unit, we will be covering the postmodernism in Canada. We'll give our understand the introductory remarks. Then we talk about the post-structuralism in Canada, and then we talk about possible post-colonial perspective, diaspora criticism, oppositional criticism, and then there are some other concerns that we can talk about, and then we conclude with the important questions. So let's start. This is postmodernism in Canada. Introductory remarks. So, postmodernism in Canada has been tackled well by Linda Hutcheon and Robert Croix. Hutcheon is able to claim for double edged weapons like irony and parody, especially efficacy within her culture, and Croix's position is not very different from hers. In an essay on Northrop Frye in the 1994 book, The Legacy of Northrop Frye, edited by Alvin A. Lee and Robert D. Denham, Hutcheon sees a tension in Frye between what she sees as his dominantly modernist, humanist approach to the literature and culture and his postmodern willingness to study Canadian literature primarily as a part of Canadian life. This move is made by Hutcheon in the essay Frye recorded modernity and the conclusions. Post structuralism in Canada, in concert with the postmodernism. This is the next part, that is 29.2. Robert Crouch is one of the Canada's leading postmodernist writers, but his critical tools are mostly closer to post-structuralist practices. A good example is the book Labyrinths of Voice, 1982, an extended interview Crouch has with Shirley Newman. The same is the case with a number of other Canadian critics, including Smarrow Camberley. Camberley as well, as we will talk about her, is crucial to our understanding of an important part of Canadian feminism. A number of Canadian writer critics like Frank Davey, George Bowring, Ellie Mandel, E.D. Blodgett, and Stephen Scobie have countered the concept of Canada and the Canadian canon constructed by some other Canadian critics. It was Frank Davey who began an effective counterattack against the line taken by Fry, Atwood, and others. In his 1974 lecture at York University entitled Surviving the Paraphrase, he acknowledged the legitimacy of cultural poetics as a critical practice but exalted literaries over other criteria. He lashed out at the emphasis on the theme that till the mid 1970s had dominated Canadian writing and criticism. He argued that the cultural nationalist critical practice stemmed from a desire to circumvent evaluation, thereby forestalling the treatment of Canadian literature as a serious genre. He considered this critical practice to be reductionist in nature, as it did no more than paraphrase the national literature in terms of international issues. He perceived that metalingual representation, or the assumption of an invariable content to which words prefer, was privileged by thematicist approaches over texture or the stylistic particularities of a work. To remedy the situation, He proposed alternative critical practices like technique, linguistic, regional, and generic studies, and phenomenologically criticism. His stance gave rise to a new school of critical thought that stressed the relevance of formal comparative contexts and argued that a critic's approach and evaluative criteria should be appropriate for the work under analysis. This view precluded neither the thematic nor the structuralist practice. Croix's stance as a critic is based on an oft quoted assertion that first appeared in a special 1974 issue of Boundary. He declared that Canadian literature evolved directly from Victorian to postmodern, negating the concepts of tradition and heritage and invoking instead a grammar of violence that endangers the written word. Robert Croix, The Exploding Porcupine, The Lovely Treachery of Words, Essays Selected and New, Toronto, Oxford University Press, 1989, page 109 to 110. He argued that the vertical layering of images, which characterized the metaphors of modernism, was replaced by horizontal extension of metonymy, which characterized postmodernism. He objected to the earlier canonical valuation, privileged content, and sought instead to centralize the intent of textual construction. He introduced an aesthetic in which emphasis shifts away from the old concerns towards aspects of form and language. His criteria for canonizing works revolves around the identification of that writing which has the potential of influencing future writing. This marks a refreshing change of outlook on canonical selection, which should be the function or the role of a work in educating readers and potential writers. He visualizes an instructional role for the Canadian canon, which should choose to focus on changing paradigms rather than the static ones usually associated with a nationalist canon. Croix concentrates on the chaos of origin as he undermines the the mythopoetic interpretations of Canadian literary identity in putting forward a radical postmodernist formulation. Labyrinths of Voice, containing Croix's conversation with Shirley Newman and Robert Wilson, is an innovative mode of discourse. The conventions of an interview are broken with the presence of three speakers. The form itself is discontinuous as it is interspersed with stimulating quotations from critics or discourse which interact with the speaker's trains of thoughts. What emerges is a rich plurality of signification and discursivity as the text traverses four broad topoi: influence, game, narration, and myth. Newman and Wilson declare Croix as author who continually rereads his own writing in the context of his current thinking. They share his view that we construct labyrinths of the airy nothingness of own imaginations, that the labyrinth is constructed of our voices, of fragments of discourse, of a mouthful of air. Against this backdrop, Croatia's critical assertions are charged with the knowledge of postmodern literary practice and post Saussurean critical thought. The first section of Labyrinths of Voice is devoted to influence, which Croix views as an engagement with the problem of artistic tradition that underlines a writer's sense of anxiety. In Beyond Nationalism, Croix furthers the cause of Canadian postmodernism, saying that the very ability to see ourselves is based on the narrative mode. The I telling the story I of we, of they that mirror us. His words advocate a variety of narrative modes instead of a single grand narrative, pointing to the direction that Canadian writing must take in order to express its polyvalent subjectivity. His writings reject a central, monolithic Canadian identity, the center being an artificial fictional concept serving only to suppress and control. Instead, his work celebrates anarchy, deliberately avoiding conclusiveness and thereby negating the view of the text as a fully finished product. This open endedness makes writers and readers accomplices in the making of the text. He says that he wants the reader to be engaged with him in fiction making. He is questioning the notion of center whether in culture, identity, or literature is contextualized not only in his writing but also in his critical stance, making his voice an important one in the Canadian postmodern discourse. Linda Hutcheon calls Crash Mr. Canadian postmodern, and her writings follow in his postmodern footsteps. Self reflexive or self conscious art or artifice demands a new engagement with the social and the historical world in which she sees postmodernism reflecting. This gives rise to metafiction or the process of creating order through myth and art. Archin finds Canadian fiction of the 90s investigating the relationship between art and language, and we choose to call reality between the discourse of art and the structures of social and cultural power. In this scenario, writers occupy an eccentric position as they embody the paradox of undermining cultural universes, going about challenging the notions of centrality in culture. In the postmodern, says Harshian, the periphery and the center are the same, and to illustrate this assertion, she compares the writings of Northrop Frye and D.G. Jones to those of Leonard Cohen and Timothy Findley. The former highlights the importance of the Bible and the biblical structures in Canadian literary enterprise. The latter parody them both exploiting and subverting their undeniable cultural authority. Hutcheon posits that the new postmodern theoretical framework of reference will bring together separate disciplines like philosophy, linguistics, history, sociology, literary criticism, and psychoanalysis. The reader, writer, and text have to meet within the context of these. When Canadian postmodern writing takes up issues like ethnicity, feminism, and immigration, it once again reiterates this point. In doing so, says Harshin, these writings has transfigured the emphasis on regionalism in literature into a concern for the different, the local, and the particular. Canadian novelists have refigured the realist regional into a postmodern different. We now move to 29.3. We talk about possible post colonial perspectives. Applying post colonial theory to the Canadian situation needs to be done with a number of ifs and buts. But one must go a little into what kind of possibilities exist. The domain in which post colonial perspective can be quite useful is native Canadian writing. When we enforce by Bakhtinian concept like heteroglossia and carnivalesque, it can help come to term with not only native Canadian text but also text by expatriate writers. One fruitful possibility is that of posting against official discourses of education, industrialization, and facts. Language rooted in play which liberates the imagination. Thomas King's poem Coyote Sees the Prime Minister, which was used earlier in one of our classes, is also quite relevant here. I remember that. Post colonial deployment of Aini is forcefully at worth in this poem. The poem reads Coyote went east to see the Prime Minister. I wouldn't make this up. And the Prime Minister was so happy to see Coyote that he made him a member of cabinet. Maybe you can help us solve the Indian problem. Sure, says that Coyote. What's the problem? When Elwood tells the story, he always laughs and spoils the ending. One of the questions raised by the leading international post colonial critic, Gayatri Spivak, is whether the subaltern is capable of speaking. Such poems give voice to all the marginalized people in different cultures. Let's talk about Unit 29.4 Diaspora Criticism in General. Here, critics like Uma Parmeshwaram matter a lot. Smarrow Camborelli theorized diaspora in her own way in her 2000 book Scandalous Bodies. Before that, what Victor Ramraj has to say about diasporic community was indeed invariably a concern with the individual's or community's attachment to the centrifugal homeland. But this attachment is countered by a yearning for a sense of belonging to the current place of abode. Caught psychically between two worlds, diasporas are transitional beings or liminal persona. That is, they are in the process of moving from one cultural state of existence to another. In this state of transition, some respond ambivalently to their dual, often antithetical cultures or societies. Some attempt to assimilate and integrate. For others, the liminal or transitional state is too prolonged or too excruciating to cope with, and they may withdraw to their ancestral identity or homeland, which is both a case on or heaven. From outside Canada, the work of Vijay Mishra, of Fijian teaching in Australia, is significant because it marks a considerable advance over the earlier formulations of writers such as William Safran. Safran's model, which he illustrates by listing the six features of diasporas dispersal, collective memory, alienation, respect, and longing for the homeland, a belief in its restoration and self definition in terms of its homeland are more applicable to the Jewish than the South Asian diaspora. Mishra considered Safran's characteristics of the Indian diaspora to be oversimplified. Mishra contrasts the diasporic consciousness with the older, primordial ethnic identities, arguing that diasporic epistemology locates itself squarely in the realm of the hybrid, in the domain of cross cultural and contaminated social and cultural regimes. In this, Mishra is akin to Bhabha, who also elevates the hybrid to the level of a new consciousness. The colonial hybrid is the articulation of the ambivalent space where the right of power is enacted on the side of desire, making its objects at once disciplinary and disseminatory or a negative transparency. Despite acknowledging the danger that diasporas may well become romanticized as the ideal social conditions, in effect, that is what the theoretical stances of critics like Mishra and Bhava are tantamount to. Neither refers to the fact that diasporic communities are known at times to support the most rabidly violent and fanatical of causes, not just ideologically but financially. In South Asia, for instance, it is well known that Sikh, Hindu, Muslim, Tamil, and other militants have been supported by overseas communities. The nature of the diaspora, its cultural location, and politics consequently depend on the nature of the host, not just on that of the diaspora. Diasporas, despite their common origin, may behave in a totally different manner depending on their country of relocation. A host country like the US, for example, ostensibly does not distinguish between immigrants and diasporic people. On a closer examination of the entire South Asian diaspora, we notice that it falls into two distinct phases. To begin with, let's call them settler and visitor diasporas. Taking our cue from the book The Empire Writes Back by Bill Ashcraft et al., which identifies settler and invader colonists. Of course, both these phrases are not entirely appropriate but may serve for the time being. To the first category belong all those forced migrations on account of slavery or indentured labor, while the second would encompass the voluntary migration of businessmen and professionals who went abroad in search of fortune. These two distinct groups may be defined not just by causes and patterns of their migration, but also by the historical period in which the migrations took place. Furthermore, these two diasporas may also be contrasted by their destinations, class and class backgrounds, attitude to the mother country, economic status, language of creative expression, market access, and so on. How do diasporas construct homelands? It seems that they do so in accordance to their own needs and compulsion. In the case of the older diaspora, we see a sudden break with the motherland. This break was not voluntary but enforced by the distances between the motherland and the diasporic settlement. The older, much slower modes of travel, and above all, the lack of economic means to make frequent journeys. In fact, the laborers who were shipped out rarely had enough money to make the journey back to India. For most, it was a one way ticket to another land. In other words, the distance, both physical but more so psychological, was so vast that the motherland remained frozen in the diasporic imagination as a sort of sacred site or symbol, almost like an idol of memory and imagination. The poverty of the homeland, which caused the diaspora in the first place, was forgotten or overwritten with the feeling that it was home, a place where the present alienation of the diasporic person did not exist. Because a physical return was virtually impossible, and emotional and spiritual renewal was ongoing necessity. This was done through a process of replication, if not reproduction. The manner in which the new diaspora imagines India is to be understood in terms of the logic of this dominant culture, of which it is an ambivalent or unwilling part. While the old diaspora was cut off from the motherland, the new diaspora has unprecedented access to it by virtue of its privileged non resident Indian status. What we see is a large narrative logic of continuous incorporation and appropriation, which reinforces the self validating logic of the new diaspora. Not forced to leave the motherland, these writers have chosen to relocate themselves in the metropolitan centers chiefly for their economic gains. This breeds in them a certain anxiety, if not guilt, towards the homeland. In the international literary marketplace, there is and that has been a niche market for fictional representations of India. Earlier, this Anglo Indian slot was occupied by English, European, and American writers. Now, the South Asians have moved in. We now move to 29.5. This would be the last but one part of unit 29. This is a positional criticism. Arnold Harishan Itwaru and Arun Mukherjee are leading names among oppositional critics in Canada. Here, a little information about Itwaru's background would be important. Itwaru, born in Guyana in 1942, has lived in Canada since 1969. Itwaru's poems, stories, critical essays, and fiction reflect his concern with alienation and rootlessness. Many of his tales are set in the troubled years of Guyana, slavery, and freedom struggle. His two main prose works are The Invention of Canada and Closed Entrances. The former is about immigrants, and the latter is a study of persistence of racism in Canada. His collections of poetry include Shattered Song, The Sacred Presence, and Body Rights Beyond the Darkening. His poems are highly evocative and create more a sense of atmosphere and images than a factual recording of the immigrant's experience. They are a blend of the imaginative and surrealistic. Using very bodily images, Itwaru conjures up a vision of the immigrant's psychological experience. Ellie Mandel praises Itwaru's collection, Shattered Songs, as powerful meditative and dramatic lyrics on the role of the outsider in our society. Body Rights poem are a celebration of the anguished soul that moves beyond the pain of endurance. Contemporary urban life, with its inertia and importance, become pain of endurance. The milieu for the outsider's feeling of entrapment and discontinuity become his persona, which conducts a never-ending death in life struggle for survival or self-identity. But survival is found only in destructions and identity in dissolution. Images of violence and destruction convey Itwaru's mental anguish and struggle in being an outsider. His truncated rhythms and experimental forms proclaim him to be a writer in search of a new world where accepted traditions fails to convey new experiences. Arun Mukherjee is an oppositional critic like Itwaru. In the introduction to her 1988 book, Towards an Aesthetic of Opposition, Mukherjee states these essays are written by a person who was born and brought up in post colonial India, had a thoroughly colonial education both in India and at the University of Toronto in Canada, and then went through a painful and difficult process of decolonization. The essays record the dialects of that struggle. In a sense, it is a collective struggle being waged in the hearts and minds of all third world people. Later in the book, in an essay called Ideology in the Classroom, a case study in the teaching of English literature in Canadian universities, she states that universalist categories of criticism have no means of dealing with the specificity of a text except in terms of setting or backdrop. The Universalist methodology, in its exaggerated focus on form and character, neglects referentiality and context, thereby failing to assign inventiveness to writers who structure their works on those principles. The Universalist critic, armed with his ready-made categories of narrative technique, symbolic patterns, motives such as a journey or quest, pastoral, etc., overlooks the formal complexities that arise when a work openly or cryptically utilizes the collective shared knowledge and experiences of a society, experience of colonialism, legends of heroes and villains, deeply held belief systems, rhetorical pronouncements of local elite such as politicians, businessmen, and movie stars. The Universalist critics' lack of interest. Just give me a second, please. Give me a second. Sorry for that. Okay, in her introduction to oppositional aesthetics, readings from a hyphenated space, Mukherjee opens up a reading up of South Asian Canadian texts, uh, South Asian Canadian texts to the dominant ideologies of literary and cultural analysis in Euro America. The essays in this collection are written from a viewpoint of a person who has lived through the colonial and post colonial experience of being Indian and an immigrant in Canada, who, as she remarks, went through the painful and difficult process of decolonization. Both the entity called Canadian literature and the essentialized Canadian identity it was premised on that has been seriously eroded. The hyphenated Canadians, as those of us who are not from the two founding nations, have challenged their authorizations by the unitary notions of national identity and asserted that being different by no means equates with being un Canadian. Itwaru's attempt to read a number of immigrant writers with diverse cultural baggages from the perspective of a theoretician who sees reality as a flux and the writer as being caught in the struggle to create meaning of a self that is related to different societal spaces is an exercise that raises many pertinent issues about nationhood. The changing self struggles for recognition in the very process of becoming, as well as unwilled transformation that takes place within an unfamiliar and evolving culture. The writer's consciousness here invents meaning to come into terms with the ambiguities, anxieties, and disorientation. Itwaru's content that in this attempt to create meaning of Canada, the immigrant himself is being invented and reinvented at various junctures. Consequently, the reality that is being represented through these writers provides substantive insights into the evolution of the culture in which they conduct their art. It was critical reading of select novels written by immigrants from different countries leads him to the assumption that Canada is merely a synecdoche that is existent that its existence lies in the way individuals and groups experience social life within the landscape named Canada. We move to the last part of Unit 29, that are other concerns. Other concerns that surface in recent Canadian criticism are concerns with ecology, concern with native expression and plight, and gay and lesbian concerns. Among writers and critics with a lesbian orientation, two famous names that are Daphne Marlatt and Dionne Brand. The latter is a lesbian of color. Her 1990 book, No Language is Neutral, has made a mark. Lesbian writing and criticism are quite widespread in Canada. In conjunction with the awareness of gay identity and gay and lesbian rights, it forms a significant part of Canadian intellectual life. In a non immediate kind of way, all this has been influenced by the French thinker Michel Foucault, The History of Sexuality. In the writing of Nicole Brossard, Daphne Marlatt, Betsy Warland, and so many other, the representation of lesbian desire is sometimes undertaken using deconstrued tools. Marlatt especially is quite expressive in her own way. There a book called Telling It, which is edited by Marlatt and others, affords us a historical look at the political involvement in the life and writings of lesbian. This book mathesizes the differences without aligning either its complexity or difficulty with its raises. The contributor to the book see themselves inhabiting fractured margins. Another important person in this is Lee Maracle. Daphne Marlet's poem In the Dark of the Coast is very important in giving us an idea of what lesbianism is about. The poem reads There is a fern frost, a gathering of small birds, melting song in the underbrush. Close you talk to one, there is a cedar slant of your hair as it falls gold over your shoulder, over your naked, dearly known skin. Its smell, its answering touch to my tongue, fondant, fond, found, all that melts pores. The dark rain of our being together at last, and the cold wind curled up fronds of tree, fern, wanting touch, our fingers separate and stiff. We haven't mourned enough, you say, for our parting, lost to each other the last time through. In the dark of this place, its fire touch, not frost, just one of the houses we passed through in the endless constellation of our being, close and away from each other, torn and apart. I did not know your hair, I did not know your skin when you beckoned to me in that last place, but I knew your eyes blue as soon as you came around the small hill. Knew your tongue, come, you said, we slide together in the spring blue of a place we had been terra incognita known, gush upwelling in the hidden north we found. We feel it thrust as the waters passed for us poured through fern, frost, volcanic thrust. It's all there. Love, we part each other coming to. Geyser spouting pool, hidden in and under separate skin, we make for each other through. The closing section of Hidden Ground, another poem by Marlat, is also significant. It reads, My untamed answering, one to sally forth, finding alternate names, finding the child provoked, invoked, lost daughter, other mother and lover, waxing tree, waste I love, water author sounding the dark edge of the words we come to. The same is true of Phyllis Webb poem called Naked Poems, Suite 1 and 2. About hidden ground, Janice Williamson writes, It is on this site an unauthorized space which is not poetry that Marla describes women's sexuality as an unmapped hidden ground. In the poems used to the Demeter Persephone myth, the lovers are simultaneously mother and daughter. Other concerns include thematic criticism of the kind exemplified by Atwood's survival also prevails in certain quarters. As far as survival itself, it was published in 1972 and suggests how prevalent images and themes in Canadian literature reveal a collective victim mentality that results from Canadians' troubled relation with the wilderness and their pervasive feelings of colonial inadequacy. So, this is Unit 29, and questions that can be important for this unit are what is the contribution of Robert Croish to theorizing about postmodernism in Canada, and how do Arnold Itwaru and Arun Mukherjee together voice oppositional concerns? We now move to Unit 30. This is Northrop Frye. In this, we delve into the general introduction. We talk about the anatomy of criticism. There is a Frye's conclusion to a literary history of Canada, and then we reach to the questions. So Northrop Frye was born in 1912 in Quebec, in Canada, in a place called Sherbrooke. He graduated in 1933 from Victoria College, University of Toronto. He won a scholarship to Oxford and got a first in English at Merton College, Oxford. In 1940, he returned to Toronto. Almost the whole of his remaining life, he taught at the University of Toronto. He died in 1991. Three of Fryer's important books are Fearful Symmetry, Anatomy of Criticism, Fables of Identity. We shall focus on mostly on the book Anatomy of Criticism, which was written in 1957, and we can also uh, understand how the general thrust of anatomy is actually an anti-new criticism. So let's begin. This is Anatomy of Criticism. Uh, the general thrust of anatomy is anti-new criticism, and Fry attacks the new critical notion that the proper perspective for criticism is microscopic linguistic analysis, and that each poem is a self-contained unity. His own argument is that criticism should stand back far enough from the poem to be able to perceive its archetypical and mythic connection with other poems. It is these patterns which serve to unify literature as a whole and comprise a literary universe or orders of words created by the poetic imagination. The poet draws on the reservoir of archetypes and conventions contained in the literary universe. The opening essays focus on the historical criticism, first by defining it and then by classifying two fictional modes. The basis of identification is the protagonist's power of action. If it is superior in kind to another man or environment, the story fiction is a myth about a god. If the power of action is superior in degree to another man and environment, then the story is romance, legend, or folktale. In case the superiority of the protagonist is greater in degree to other men but not environment, the work belongs to the high mimetic mode of epic and tragedy. Works in which the protagonist is one of us, that is, superior neither to man nor environment, are illustrations of the low mimetic mode of comedy and realistic fiction. In works where the protagonist is inferior in power and intelligence to the reader, who gets a sense of looking down on him, the work belongs to the Ionic mode. The classification of fiction thus derives from the hero's power of action. Power here amounts to freedom. The second essay, Ethical Criticism, elucidates the theory of symbols. Here, the order of freedom is an ascending one with that descriptive and the formal shapes of symbolic structure, both in some way accountable to nature. Words, phrases, or images used as kinds of special reference are termed symbols. Symbols are called signs when they stand for and point to things outside the place when they occur. There are two facets of a symbol, the literal and the descriptive, and the friar leaves it to criticism to include one or both in its sweep. Criticism with a literal bent of mind informs how the pattern of words in a work turns away from the obvious meaning, while criticism inclined to be descriptive evaluates the symbolism within works as an ambiguous structure of interlocking motifs. Fry's third essay, entitled Archetypal Criticism, seeks to analytically present his theory of myths. He begins by stating that myth is a literary framework, represent an abstract or purely literary world of fictional and thematic design, unaffected by canons of plausible adaptation to familiar experience. Its imitation of actions near or that at the conceivable limits of desire identifies three tendencies in the archetypal symbols of literature. The first he terms as undisplayed myth, which concerns itself with gods and demons and is presented as two contrasting topographical metaphors, one desirable, the other undesirable. The second is the romantic world, suggested in the implicit patterns of human experience. The third, which he calls the tendency of realism, emphasizes content and representation rather than the shape of the story. Comedy is on top, followed by romance, then tragedy, and then irony and satire. Fry's fourth essay is Anatomy of Criticism, has to do with rhetorical uh, criticism. He begins by defining rhetoric as a middle term that describes speech writing varying between the ornamental and the persuasive. Ornamental rhetoric draws the hearers or the reader's admiration towards its own beauty and wit while manipulating emotions. Persuasive rhetoric is a kind of applied literature which, by reinforcing the power of argument, articulates emotion. The three traditional Greek genres, drama, epic, and lyric, are derived from the rubric of rhetoric. The distinction between the three lie is in what? Fry, the radical of representation, which revolves around the acted, spoken, or written word. The encyclopedic form of the Bible is discussed at length by Fry in a separate section of the fourth essay, calling it the central sacred book of our culture. Fry emphasizes its systematic construction as a definitive myth extending over time and space, over invisible and visible orders of reality, and with a parabolic dramatic structure of which the five acts are creation, fall, exile, redemption, and restoration. Myth, legend, historical reminiscence, and actual history are inseparable in Bible. The text breaks down into smaller and smaller fragments, taking on the appearance of a sequence of a discontinuous but rightly ordered series of significant moments of apprehension or vision. Then we come to Unit 30.3, Fry's conclusion to literary history of Canada. In this very important statement, Fry produces a synthesis of Canadian culture. He creates a Canadian myth. He also projects an imaginative continuum which can help Canadian writers and their recorders face new threats to their identity. English Canada showed an inclination towards maintaining links with the parent culture, while French Canada favored the notion of itself as a fragment pursuing its down separate destiny in North America. Recent canonical and literary debates acknowledge a sense of spiritual continuity with British or American models, but insist that ethnic diversity is a reality and will hold sway in the times to come. In his conclusion to A Literary History of Canada, Northrop Frye has posed a significant historical question about Canadian identity when he asserted that it is not the literary voices that chose to respond to what is here question that truly address themselves to the country's formulation of its literary canon. This assertion underlines the topographical bent of Canadian writing, which focused on the physical environment of the land. Canadian national consciousness emphasizes a sense of difference that is steeped in the awareness of the uniqueness of place. Geography complement history as literary creativity took off. He initially attributes to Canadians a kind of garrison mentality and also defines a garrison. A garrison is a closely knit and beleaguered society, and its moral and social values are unquestionable. Within the conclusion, he had revises his views and states as the center of Canadian life moves from the fortress to metropolis, the garrison mentality changes correspondingly. It begins as an expression of moral values generally accepted in the group as a whole, and then as society gets more complicated and more in control of its environment. It becomes more of a revolutionary garrison with a metropolitan society. But though it changes from a defense to an attack on what society accepts as conventional defense of to an attack on conventional standards, the literature it produces at every stage tends to be rhetorical, an illustration or allegory of certain social attitude. These attitudes help to unify the mind of the writer by externalizing his enemy, the enemy being the anti creative elements in life as he sees life. To approach these elements in a less rhetorical way would introduce the theme of self conflict, a more perilous but ultimately more rewarding theme. The conflict involved is between the poetic impulse to construct and the rhetorical impulse to assert. And the victory of the former is the sign of the maturing of the writer. So, this is the end of Unit 30, and important questions are what makes Fryer's Anatomy of Criticism a key text in Canadian criticism? What are the various types of criticism that Fryer talks about in Anatomy of Criticism? What is the argument of Fryer's conclusion to a literary history of Canada? So we take a break right now for 10 minutes, and then we continue with Unit 31 and 32. So please take a break for 10 minutes. We meet exactly at 4:15. Thank you. Let's resume. So, we now begin with Unit 31 and we discuss about Linda Hutcheon. In this unit, we will discuss about Hutcheon's overall view of postmodernism, postmodernism at large, where we discuss about departures from modernism. We discuss about Midnight's Children as postmodernist text and postmodernism's point of convergence with post-structuralism. Let's begin. Linda Hutcheon is one of the foremost Canadian critics of recent times. She was born in Toronto in 1947. In her 1989 book, The Politics of Postmodernism, Hutcheon sees postmodernist art as a political practice which criticizes representation from within. More specifically, Canadian concerns come through in her 1988 book, The Canadian Postmodern. Here, she says that to render the particular concrete and to glory in local eccentricity is what the Canadian postmodern amounts to. In the same book, Hutcheon sees Robert Crush's novel, The Sturd Horseman, as the exemplary postmodernistic novel. This novel is chaotic, irrational, farcical, idiosyncratic, perverse, a veritable gamut of all that play as a postmodern fictional strategy signifies. The Sturd Horseman is a tall tale with Homeric parallels. An Alberta rancher, Hazard Lepage, sets out on an odyssey looking for suitable mares for his great blue stallion, Poseidon. Much of the book's raunchy humor centers on the parallel between the horse imposing member and the member of the stud horseman himself, which is known as Old Blue. The book is also loosely based on variants of the Isis myth, but in Crochet's version of the goddess, Demeter is a male whose role is that of a Lepage's biographer and rival in love. Hazard's disguises enable Crochets to indulge in riotous parody of history, myth, religion, morality, form, the whole range of codified sets of beliefs and values. Hazard's journey metaphorically parallels the mythic wanderings of Odysseus. The prevailing tone in other Crochet's novel, like What the Crow Said and The Puppeteer, is that of parody. One particular excerpt from page number 183 of the Canadian Postmodern Hutcheon states that Robert Crush is the Mr. Canadian Postmodern. Hutcheon detailed comments on Crochet in her book, The Canadian Postmodernism, goes as follows. For years now, critics have been working out the parodic iterations between the Odyssey and the Stud Horseman, Badlands, and Alibi. These parodies of the familiar and seemingly universal do not so much destroy myth as demythify and demystify it into stories fictions. These, in turn, are less universal than recognizable and reusable, and the difference is crucial. They can be used and abused. Much of the mythic material is presented ambivalently. Water, for instance, is symbolic of both death and rebirth in all of Croatia's work, while on the surface, this resembles, as we have seen before, T.S. Eliot's modernist ambivalence about water in the Westland. In Croat's work, there is always a postmodern tension between the implied universals of the mythic story and the anecdotal texture, narrativity of fiction. The interchange here is what deconstructs myth and allows a way out of the enwrapping tendency of myth to want to explain everything one way. For Croats, the response is to retell it and retell it differently. The appeal of myth to modernists, if I may generalize a little recklessly, was in its purpose not only of universality but of coherence and lasting meaning. Croatia's parody are not all mythic, however. Besides the conventions of biography, the Studhars take on everything from Nabokov's Pale Fire to Tennyson's The Lady of Shalott. The broader conventions of the Western genre are also parodied. Hazard and Poseidon both represent and misrepresent the traditional relationship between cowboy and horse. In Gone Indian, the ending of the Western is parodied. Jeremy and Boy ride off into the sunset, but they are seeking nothing. We come to Unit 31.2, where we discuss about Hutchian overall view of postmodernism. Broadly, Hutchian is in a position that undermines Marxist history and places great values on histories in the plural. This move is part of the general resistance offered by her theory to monadic totalizations of various kinds. She sees postmodern fiction as exploiting and yet putting into question notions of closure, totalization, and universality that are part of challenged grand narratives. It is a belief that rather than seeing this paradoxical use and abuse as a sign of decadence or cause for despair, it might be possible to postulate a less negative interpretation that would allow for at least the potential for radical critical possibilities. Trying to find totalizing narratives that dissolve differences and contradictions is delusive in her view. A novel like Rushdie's Midnight's Children is crucial to her theorizing. Rushdie's novel offers histories in the plural and at the same time works to prevent any interpretation of the contradiction within its as it simply the outer discontinuous signs of some repressed unity, such as Marxist history or the real. Critique is as important as complicity in the response of cultural postmodernists to the philosophical and socio-economic realities of postmodernity. Postmodernism here is not so much what Jameson sees as a systemic form of capitalism as the name given to the cultural practices which acknowledge their inevitable implications in capitalism without relinquishing the power or will to intervene critically in it. With a view to claiming for postmodernist art the ability to intervene critically in the socio-economic order that grounds postmodernity, even while it is itself implicated in that order, Hutchin tries to posit a distinction between postmodernism as a cultural and aesthetic mode and postmodernity as a designation of a social and philosophical period or condition. Within the Canadian context, that kind of an enabling move opens up spaces for post coloniality, ethnicity, and multiculturalism. But all the dangers that Jameson sees inherent in postmodernism do not appear by that move. After all, Jameson relates his description of postmodern to the death of modernist norms and characterizes postmodern parody as parody in which belief in the impossibility of norm contrasts with the modernist challenges to norms. Moving ahead to 31.3, postmodernism at large. Departures from postmodernism. Departures from modernism. Modernism is a covered term for certain tendencies in early 20th century art and literature. The motivating slogan at the back of these tendencies was "Make it new." You have already looked at, you might have read Westland, T.S. Eliot, and a portrait of the artist as Young Men by James Joyce. Uh, the heyday of modernism was period between 1910 and 1930. Postmodernism fully came into its own in its late 1950s and the early 1960s. What marks it is a mood of radical interdependency and a tone of self conscious skepticism towards previous certainties in personal, intellectual, and political life. Modernism also has skepticism, but of a less absolute kind. Also, postmodernism is satisfied with surfaces where postmodernism did strive for a certain kind of depth. Postmodernism fascination is with popular art forms and its mood is less elegiac than that of modernism. Postmodernism does not fully abandon modernism's mood of alienation. However, whereas the modernist writer was more keen on trying to wrest a meaning from the world through myth, symbol, or formal complexity, the postmodernist writer greets absurdity or meaninglessness existence with an indifference which combines resignation, fatigue, and playfulness. Most postmodernist narratives have great self reflexivity, which means that they double back on their own presuppositions, assumptions, and ways of telling the story. Midnight Children, as a postmodernist text, Salman Rushdie's novel Midnight Children, which is concerned with the life of Salim Sinai, who was born at midnight on August 15th, 1947, is a good example of a postmodernist text. Rushdie seeks to challenge the conventional narrative through blurred boundaries of discourse, through textual play, through explicit and implicit parody, and through the hybridization of language. Chaotic multiplicity and plenitude is celebrated, as are creative tensions between personal and national identity. The narrator's self is subject to fluidity. His dealings with Padma are sometimes mocking, sometimes loving. He keeps mocking his own self all the time. The hold of realism is loosened through fantasy. The local is celebrated as we find in the loving care which Rushdie bestows on details on Bombay life. Aini is playful and liberating. The family's fortunes and the nation's fortunes are subjected to the same flippancy. Most of the lineages, origins, culture, and religious practices, political manipulations, and the working of media all are subjected to playful treatment. Mimicry also has an important role in the proceedings. Ideas about origins, center, presence, and historical explanation itself are undetermined all the time. More than this, an element of the mock heroic is also at work. Exaggerations of various kinds and the elements of bathos anticlimax introduced at the crucial points in the narrative are all part of the overall playful thirst. Desire and nostalgia merge in such a way that the subject caught in their net emerges as quite fluid and provisional. Events of the emergency period and the war of Bangladesh liberation are given a playful treatment, and the parodic element is ever present. Dreams mingle with reality, mystery with magic, and truth with fantasy. Some other notable postmodern texts also can be Allen Ginsberg's poem Howl, Samuel Beckett's play Waiting for Godot, Guntur's Grass novel The Tin Drum, and Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude. All have a palpable presence of postmodern features in them. Sometimes the name given to fiction of this kind is magic realism. This term refers to the techniques of combining the realistic depictions of events and characters with elements of the fantastic, often drawn from myth, dreams, and fairy tales. Mostly, there's a lot of comment on the way the narrative itself got made and on the status of the narrator himself or herself. Moving to the next one, next section, postmodernism points of convergence with post structuralism. Julie Rifkin and Michael Ryan state in the book Literary Theory, an anthology edited by them, in 1979, post structuralism changed names. But as any post structuralist will tell you, when names change, things change. Post structuralism, a term used mostly in the Anglophone Academy, found itself being replaced by a new word, actually, an old word transplanted from America to France and back again. That word was postmodernism. Lyotard published a book that year entitled The Postmodern Condition, a report on knowledge, in which he calls the contemporary historical situation in which the Old West European master narratives of progressive subjective enlightenment and national liberation no longer apply to the world of micronarratives that could not be dominated by any single legitimating meta-narrative. Instead, a criterion of scientific and economic performative or usefulness and technical economic effectiveness has replaced the old rationalist ideal of a legitimating meta-language, and it is linked to the growing power of cooperation. The major point of convergence between post structuralism and postmodernism is that both are seen as part of the logics of disintegration. Post structuralism changed names and found itself act replaced by postmodernism. That may not be an accurate way of putting it, but the validity of this common criticism of the two trends remain. The common criticism is that both contribute to the logics of disintegration. Here we need to know a little about modernity. This is a name for the post feudal era, which thinkers like the German Jürgen Habermas treat as one of the progressive enlightenment or rationalism. One could say that we have got long been under the sway of reason in the pursuit of rational laws and procedures. By choosing the words postmodernism and postmodernity to characterize the contemporary era, Lyotard was implicitly criticizing Habermas. Lyotard's basic position is that in the contemporary historical situation, the old European master narratives of progressive, subjective enlightenment and rational liberation no longer apply. Truth can no longer be seen as the possession of rational subject, nor is it a property of a reality that could be described objectively using objective scientific methods. The so called truth and reality are determined by the effectivity of knowledge within a particular economic situation, dominated by corporations possessing the power not only to shape the world, but to say what counts as a scientific truth regarding that world. Most of these awareness are reinforced by what Baudrillard has to say about virtual reality or the fact of the real being defined in the terms of the media in which it moves. The work of Derrida, Lacan, Foucault, and Ronald Barthes collectively undermine subjectivity as agency and truth as enabling. Now, moving to the next section, the important questions for this unit can be: in what respects is postmodernism different from modernism? Why is John Lyotard distrustful of grand narratives? What are the postmodernistic features of Rushdie's Midnight Children? How do both postmodernism and poststructuralism contribute to the logics of disintegration? Moving to the last unit for Block 8, Unit 32. This is Unit 32, and It's about Smarrow Camberley. We talk about Smarrow Camberley in general. We talk about the concern with otherness and ethnicity, and then followed by important questions. Among younger critics teaching and writing in Canada, Smarrow Camberley is a leading name. She is the author of a number of path breaking studies. Camberley was born in Greece. She migrated to Canada and is now a leading Canadian critic. She is a professor of Canadian literature and post colonial and diasporic theories and director of the graduate program in the English department at the University of Victoria. She is a major voice on feminism, multiculturalism, and diaspora. She is the author of the On the Edge of the Genre, the contemporary Canadian long poem. She edited Making a Difference, Canadian multicultural literature. She is also the co editor of Amazing Space, Writing Canadian Women Writing. A part of her introduction to Making a Difference, an anthology of Canadian multicultural literature, is self explanatory. She states, Making a Difference, an anthology of Canadian multicultural literature, at once celebrates what has been called minority literature in Canada and attempts to change our understanding of what minority literature is. What makes this anthology of Canadian literature different is its gathering together of both poetry and fiction by authors who come from a wide range of racial, ethnic, and cultural backgrounds beginning with F.P. Grove and Laura Goodman Salverson, the first non Anglo Celtic writers to achieve recognition in Canada, and including First Nations authors. This anthology belongs to the genealogy of Canadian literature, a body of writings that come from a variety of traditions that used to kept separate from the so-called main tradition. One of my primary intention has been to create a space in which contributors to the anthology might dialogue with each other without suspending their differences. Through their poetry, their fiction, and their statements about their writing that are cited in the headnotes, this anthology enables these authors to speak with each other across boundaries that are marked by many differences be the differences of race, of ethnic origin, of gender, of place, of ideological affiliation, or of thematic concerns and aesthetics. They characterize these literature in remarkable ways. Each of the 71 contributors speak in her or this particular accent. I use the word accent here not so much as the language marker announcing that the origins of someone, like me for example, lie outside Canada, but rather as a sign of particularities, of differences that do not become absent or are not rendered silent. The writers in this anthology make a difference because when read together, they invite the reader to consider the social, political, and cultural context that have produced Canadian literature in general and their work in particular. Camberley emphasizes also the material conditions under which cultural writing is produced, consumed, and disseminated. She also asserts that the questions that have been central to making of the anthology in question are as to how we function as subjects of our own representations and how we figure as objects into representation of others. How culture is defined and who implements these definitions. What or who devises the boundaries that determine how cultural differences, be it celebrated or curtailed, is represented. Amazing Space, written in 1986, is an anthology Camberley edited along with Shirley Newman. The aim is to engender a special kind of internality with concerns on issues that concerns women writers as critics. The woman here becomes a site to which the woman writes as she moves in it and merges with it to lend its substance. A word here about Kimberly treatment of the long poem in the preface to On the Edge of Genre. 1991, Smarrow Camberley says the long poem has been read as a lyric, as an epic, as a discursive narrative, as a postmodern text, but these readings, although partly invited by the long poem itself, are, I argue here, already misreadings based on the generic fallacy that a literary text, no matter how complex, tends to privilege on one genre among the many it might borrow from. The long poem cannot be read as if it were an extended lyric, a strange epic, strange because of our unheroic times, or as if it were a narrative poem. It may share the emotive tonalities of the lyric, but it does not sanction the lyric's brevity. It may share epic's intent to sing of national matters and anxieties. O Canada, but this does show in ways that parody the epic ethos. These contradictions, this breach of promise, are what this study focuses on. It is not my desire to resolve or reconcile these contradictions. Rather, my intention is to understand the generic restlessness of the long poem, why and how it engages itself with disparate elements only to subvert their functions and ideologies. Camberley adds, the long poem then makes itself felt through its discontinuities, its absence, and its deferrals by foregrounding both its writing process and our reading act. While it is interested in the materiality of language, it is also concerned with the unreadability of the world's textuality. Coming to the next unit, the subsection of this unit, 32.2, Camberley is concerned with otherness and ethnicity. In her 2000 book, Scandalous Bodies, Camberley goes into the question of otherness. One important text that she talks about in Other Solitudes, Canadian multicultural fiction, Other Solitudes, I suggest, has become a prominent text of its kind, not because ethnicity has always been a part of the canon, but because it affiliates itself into two dominant national narratives, that of the mainstream literary canon and that of the official multiculturalism policy. Along the same lines, its publication by major publishing house guarantees its wide distribution and by extension critical attention. Its exclusive focus on fiction, the most accessible and commodified of literary forms, is also a factor contributing to its marketability. Similarly, the fact that its title is cleared intended to remind readers of Hugh MacLennan's canonical text, Two Solitudes, an icon of Canadian cultural politics, aligns the anthology with the very canon it wishes to be an extension of, while inviting us to be believing that the politics of ethnicity today is not different, at least structurally, from the politics of the two founding nations. In the second last section, the first and the founding nation respond, which equals to the interviews with Thompson, Highway, Jacks, Godbout, and Robertson Davis addresses the title's allusion and is meant to demonstrate the plurality of Canadian culture. It would seem then other solitudes is designed to erase the marginalization of ethnic writing, whereas its sections take a critical look at many aspects of multiculturalism and ethnic experience. Its editorial strategies counterbalance what minority as a political and cultural sign entails. The overall editorial intent is to present a single model of Canadian history, a model affirming the magnanimity of the majority culture, whose celebration of diversity becomes yet another way of containing it. Thus, ethnicity is inscribed in the editorial statement as a domesticated identity. The editors leave no room for representation of ethnicity as what Abdul Jan Muhammad and David Lloyd call a product of damage, damage more or less systematically inflicted on cultures, produced as minorities by the dominant culture. Hutchian postmodernist injunction in her response to the reception of other solitudes demonstrates that, in postmodern terms, ethnic difference is endowed with political value precisely because it is named, because naming allows identities previously ignored and subjugated to become present. But this presencing, as I will attempt to show, makes ethnicity a sign of cultural excess. Ethnic identity is one of the many eccentric identities that Hutchian's postmodernism embraces right in a poetics of postmodernism, celebrating the visibility of one side of the us and them dialectic while asserting the necessity of the others does not promise a militantly anti humanistic way of critiquing the legacy of binary thinking. Within the postmodern view of the world, the term eccentric functions not so much to designate a condition or a site where an ethnic subject resides as it does to recast marginality as a palatable and thus consumable cultural product. In this heterogeneous yet logocentric postmodernism, ethnicity never moves beyond the eccentric aliens of feminist issues. What Hutchian views of multiculturalism postulates is, in typical postmodern fashion, a paradox, a Canada that articulates a totalization national discourse of consciousness and makes space for negotiator difference. Hutchian does not explain how this consciousness is to be achieved when differences are still under negotiation, when the negotiation are to be conducted by a society whose self-image as a dominant remains intact. Perhaps the resolution of this paradox lies in her defense of official multiculturalism as an ideal. In this context, a totalizing national discourse can bring about Hutchian proposed unity only if it suspends differences as counter discourses. It is in this way, the same way in which official multiculturalism gives us subjects without history, that Hutchian Canadian national imagery can encompass ethnicity. The consensus by which this national discourse can remain totalizing and the same time embody ethnicity has a disciplinary function. However, ethnicity is defined, it most yield to the totalizing impulse of such a nation. A consensual community of this kind, a community presumably without ethnic margins, would include negotiator difference, but for this negotiation to succeed, minorities' experiences of difference would have to be subsumed. Instead, such a multicultural nation will continue to assert its allegiance to the modernist discourse of nationalism. It will be an imagined community, the kind that occupies homogeneous, empty time, a community whose historical maternity will consist in its misremembering of its past. So, this is the end of Unit 32. Important question for this unit. What, in brief, are the striking individual qualities of Smarrow Camberley as a critic? And in what terms does Camberley view difference? Briefing about the answer. So we are done with block 8 today. With this, we are also over with MEG-12, a survey course in 20th century Canadian literature. Thank you all for being there. Thank you. Have a good evening.